Hello, my name's Charles Brennan, and thank you for joining me to another coffee chat with the editor of the International Journal of Food Science and Technology. And today I've got the pleasure of having Dr. Claire Munialo here from Harper Adams University in the UK to talk about one of her papers. And you've done lots of papers for us, thank you very much, all about alternative proteins. I think the latest one, correct me if I'm wrong, Claire, is about sort of the exploitation of alternative proteins and sustainability and why? What drove you to do this research?
First of all, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to talk about my research, and I'm so grateful that I get to do this in this space and in this way. I am so much captivated, so to say, or so interested in alternative proteins because number one, my PhD was all about exchangeability of proteins.
Okay.
Number two, we are all talking about sustainability at the moment with the current global talks about the issues to do with livestock production with the COP28 they just completed not long ago, where food systems became something that was talked about. And obviously we know that food production contributes towards global warming and we need to do something about it. And so in my little way, I'm able to contribute towards that through the research that I do.
And it's so topical because, like you say, at the moment, I think IJFST are just about an update on their food systems and sustainability framework. And that speaks to what you've written here about that sustainability issue. How do you view that in terms of policy and the direction that we're going in Europe and also the global aspect, like you said?
I think there's quite a lot of things that still need to be done. As you're talking about policy, of course, there's a lot that needs to be done to be included. But I feel like even before we go to the policy frameworks and things like that, there is work that still needs to be done. And understanding really, for example, if you talk about exchangeability of proteins or alternative proteins, everybody thinks about soy. And we know very well there's quite a lot of competition to do with things like animal feed and things like that. So definitely soy might not be the solution. So if you're going to make a policy, what are you going to include in that policy? So we need to understand the framework and understand other alternatives that can be used so that they can be included in this work. And that's where my research comes from. I'm not concentrating on soy. I'm trying to understand other alternatives that can be used rather than concentrating on soy.
I think that's so important because when we think about soy proteins or dairy proteins and alternative proteins, we think about it potentially from the consumer's point of view for the choice. But from the industry point of view, you know, that's a really complex situation in terms of which alternative proteins to use and how to use them.
Absolutely. And that's one thing I usually say, like a lot of people are doing work on alternative proteins, but they are coming from the angle of the social side of things, consumer perception, willingness to buy, willingness to purchase. But I come from the other angle of understanding their functionality. So I want to understand, for example, if you knock out whey protein from a product or gelatin, can you replace it with pea protein and still get similar functionality? Obviously, after spending 4 years of my PhD trying to do that, I realized that it's not that straightforward. And so when you start to think about, okay, I'm going to remove that protein and replace it with an alternative, obviously we know from Mother Nature, these two things are not the same.
No.
So you need to understand some functionality. But then once you might think like, I got it right, I now understand the functionality, you make a product, and then there comes issues to do with taste, things to do with all these of flavors and things like that. So you need to mask that. If you're masking that, what are you adding? What does that have implications to the consumer in terms of the price, in terms of the nutritional value? So that's how we are coming and how I look at it with my research.
I think with me as a consumer, I look at a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, I think, okay, how can I replace dairy protein with alternative proteins, with plant proteins? And and soy is a good example, but pea or oats or things like that. So if you think about your work and the future of that consumer related things, where do you think the next steps are?
I feel like the consumers are becoming obviously aware of the impact of animal production, for example, and what it does to the environment. So a lot of people are making shifts, and some of the shifts are, as you say, going to things like pea protein, soy milk, potato milk, so to say, if you wanted any kind of milk. But then I think consumers will become a little bit more aware and want to understand, if I'm paying £1 to be able to buy a liter of soy milk and getting something that will be nutritionally, so to say, slightly inferior compared to drinking dairy milk, what is the compromise? And so the industry will try to ensure understand, which already they're doing at the moment, things like fortification and adding in some other additives that will help. But then again, going back to the consumer myself, now looking at it like not being a scientist but a consumer, I want to understand, what are the additives doing to my food? What is it, the long-term impact? I might have an E number, for example, on a packet. Do I understand what that means? Do I need a dictionary to be able to understand the E numbers? And are we not having a situation where we may have issues later on, and it goes back to the consumer awareness and knowledge? Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, and going down to the supermarket, looking at supermarket shelves and looking at the back of the pack. I'm a great advocate of trying to look at what the ingredients are and those E numbers, and we're looking at clean labels for the food industry and for the consumers. That's a real responsibility in terms of alternative protein.
Absolutely. And of course we also know it's not something that it's recent. We've seen lots of protests around the world, recently in France with the farmers. We'll have also those places where some people will feel like, when I was doing this research, for example, I looked at a couple of papers that are actually looking at some farming community thinking like, we're gonna lose livelihood, forget about even those labels and everything, but we depend on livestock for our livelihood. So if you're removing that and you're asking us to do with alternative proteins, what's gonna happen to our cows? What's going to happen to our goats and things like that? So going back into understanding the places where, for example, I work at Harper, is a typical farming background, and I've had conversations with my students. We sit down and we're talking about alternative proteins, and outrightly they'll say to you, I'm from a farming background, I'm not going to see myself consuming an alternative protein. Talk about things like alternative meats as well. Are we really mimicking the real texture? We can do that, but how about the nutritional value? And there are all those things that still needs to be looked at.
So there's that protein digestibility story, which, look, we haven't got time to cover that, but I suppose, thank you for coming. But if we were trying to encourage the reader for the first time to pick up your paper or one of your papers, what would you say to that reader in terms of, what's the message you want to convey?
I feel like we are concentrating a lot on the carbon footprint, which is what a lot of people are talking about. We need to stop animal production, we need to reduce and things like that. But I strongly feel that there is something else that we are neglecting, things like the water footprint of these alternative proteins. Yes, it's good. Alternative proteins are good for the environment, but then looking at it are other issues to do with water consumptives and things like that. So anybody picking up my paper and wanting to read it to understand what it's all about, I'm trying to look at it from a point of like, if you're going down the route of alternative proteins, try to understand, if I need more water to produce a liter of soy protein or a liter of soy milk, is that something that will be an issue in the end still to do with sustainability? But also, I feel like the best thing will be trying to understand, well, there are those limitations of alternative proteins, but probably maybe getting to a point of balancing. So you're like, I'm balancing my diet balancing, maybe consuming a little bit less meat that we consume, and then trying to include other, I call them plant rather than generally extracts and things like that, because we know, of course, there are all the issues to do with extractions of proteins, etc. But also, if you just consume plants, which includes fruits and vegetables, that will contribute to a balanced diet, I think.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, Claire from Harper. Yeah, if anyone's interested, could they contact you via your email?
Absolutely. Yeah. So again, as you've mentioned, I teach at Harper University, Harper Adams University.
Yeah.
So it will be a great pleasure, and I would love to engage with anybody who is interested in understanding a little bit more the framework of alternative proteins, because as I say, it is something that I'm pretty much interested in.
So we can continue our discussion over a cup of tea, thank you.
Absolutely.
But anyone who's interested, I'll plug the paper at the end of this talk or in the comments section of the video so that you can refer back to it. And once again, thank you, Claire.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.